And the people on the committee, myself.
Hi, I'm Erin Greb, and I work independently, and many of my clients are university presses, and it's been over the last 10 years that, the standards haven't been they haven't really changed much until maybe over the last year. I've seen some presses pay more attention to maps, but overall, I really thought that this was a necessary conversation to have.
And then, yeah.
Oh, thanks. I'm Molly O'Halloran. I also work for myself, and about half my clients are university press authors, usually, or sometimes directly the press.
And I'm Tanya Buckingham, and I run the UW Cartography Lab, and we work with several university presses around the country, also presses and authors.
So we're going to run through, first we're going to take a look at what those factors are that university presses are running into that are sort of our delimiters that we didn't necessarily know about coming into this. And then we're going to go through the specs that we have in draft form, and we are specifically looking for feedback from you, really on 2 points. One is what did we miss? What things do you like? And say, oh yeah, I had that time with University of whatever press, and if only they had had this spec in there, it would have saved a whole lot of grief. And also, what have we what did we get wrong? What did we in our 3 or 4 of us look at that is a problem in terms of if this spec were out there, it would give you a difficulty making stuff. So, Molly, you're going to do?
I can.
Erin's going to do this? Erin's going to do this, okay.
So what you see here, this is just a brief collection of some of the specs that we've gotten from presses over the years. And the one on the left there is University of Nebraska Press, and they're the only one that I've worked with so far that has, it's a 4-page cartography requirement page. They have some samples of maps that I had done for them that are in the back that sort of show this is what a good map would look like. So I think it worked pretty well. There are still some limitations in there that I might disagree with, but I was really proud of what they came up with. And, in there they have, this is what the typical page size is. The map should usually not go beyond this width. So it's very, very detailed. And then you'll go and see something like the one on the right for Purdue is, just, excuse me, very, very general. A lot of times they'll lump in the map specifications in with all of line art. So it'll be charts, graphs, maps. A lot of presses handle all of that as the same thing. And, we'll have limitations like, you can't have a line smaller than 1 point, or text has to be 8 point or larger. So it's things that maybe would work well for a graph in an image that might be shrunk down to fit a page, but not if you're designing a map at 100% for a book. So this is just a small collection of what we've encountered over the years.
So, who did you say was? Should I just do it? Okay. So, what we got from Lisa. The guidelines aren't just for cartographers or people who think of themselves as cartographers. They also go to authors. Presses try to discourage authors from making their own artwork unless they're an expert cartographer or a map person themselves, but sometimes they do. And this is particularly true for smaller projects, things that are small-scale monograph series or journal work, or things that people will come up with something and even send in laser prints of artwork, and the journal will have to use that anyway. One of the things Lisa talked about is that increasingly university presses are using packagers, which will be for, I'm not sure it's for editorial, I think it's, but certainly for design and production. The layout, the ebook conversion, all the graphics, the cover design, the pre-press, all the handling of the physical put this thing, make it into a book, will handle that. And they often will have someone on staff who's a graphics person, one of whose jobs is to make maps, but who doesn't have cartography as a primary expertise point. Varying levels of expertise for that. And so that's part of what the guidelines are for, is to give them some limit so that the packager doesn't come back with a package with a bunch of maps that aren't what they're looking for. Page layout, when they give a cartographer a spec, and those of you who've done this know this, they don't know what the page layout's going to be when they assign you the map. They say, well, it's going to be 5 by 7-ish on the page. So getting from them a specification that will work with whatever the page size ends up being is a problem. So you can count on it quite possibly being shrunk. You want to have it within a range that won't be shrunk, from this big to this big. But that is an issue. Digital printing and subsequent uses in print on when the offset version is done and becomes a print on demand book have really limited quality in terms of, certainly compared to offset. So even if it's going its first edition as an offset book, which more and more they're not. They're going smaller print runs especially are simply going straight to digital printing, and they simply don't have the same level of control for graphics. So screens will not reproduce as supplied. Thin lines will drop out. There are issues around that, and that's part of what the specs are to proof against, is to get you relatively resilient artwork. And then the deliverables, again, you don't even necessarily know what the deliverables are going to be over time for an edition, but ebooks and web versions of maps, depending on the different projects, they often come out at the same time, but often you're making artwork for something that is going to be repurposed and repackaged and who knows someplace down the line. So again, ebook versions especially are graphics on your Kindle or your Nook may not be anything like the level of resolution that you're counting on for your really delicate map. So that's the framework. So these are kind of the outline of what we were talking with Lisa about. So we talked about the production workflow, that page layout isn't necessarily, you're designing for a pick and a poke, essentially. One of the things we talked about was the old standards weren't necessarily clear about file formats. And for those of us who've been around for a while, preferred format has changed. EPS seems to be the preferred format these days, although PDF is still a thing you can often deliver.
Yeah, maybe we could start getting feedback from everybody out there. Are there any other file formats besides these that you've needed to supply, or do you think this, like, supplying an EPS seems to be most of what I have to supply?
Sometimes they will ask you a TIFF only.
Something
They'll ask for a TIFF
for a
file?
TIFF?
High resolution, yeah.
High resolution TIFF.
And in what circumstances do they ask for a TIFF?
TIFF, they will ask you at least a 600 dpi.
Okay.
I've heard from Cambridge Press, University Press.
Okay.
Interesting. So from Cambridge University Press, they said, yeah. So
They don't want any of these vector drawings. They want just as an image.
interesting. Can you say more about the circumstance? Are there particular categories of publications that seems to be the norm? I was going to try to move this here. But by the way, nothing that isn't on the mic is going to be recorded, and we want to record these things so that we can make notes and talk to the people.
You want to say something? No. What I've found is actually the small publishers, they prefer to have just as a graphic, and they consider any of the map as just a pure graphic, not really as a vector drawing. So the specification is almost the same as photographs. They will ask you exactly the same specification. And sometimes they will not tell you exactly the page size. They will say roughly around this so that they can squeeze it or enlarge it. And I usually tell them, no, tell me exact the set size. And that's what I try to do, it emphasize as much as possible, So, but it'll vary. Like sometimes they will ask you 600 DPI, sometimes they'll say, I want 1200 DPI. It doesn't make any sense, but you try to give them whatever they want. And I think most of the people are graphic designers, and they wanted to put in a page layout, and that's what they want.
Go ahead.
Is that okay? Okay.
Yeah, I see. I get more so requests for PDFs than EPS these days. The old days, I would get more EPS files. And I would definitely add with Wayne Gale. I get a lot of presses. We probably do maybe 80 maps a year for academic presses, 50 to 80 depending on the year. And often it's just sometimes they don't have the skill set to deal with an EPS, or actually if you send them separate fonts or embed the fonts. So often I get the same request of just super high res. TIFF is a lot easier. I also don't like them messing with my fonts. So I'm kind of particular about that, because if they know how to do it, they sometimes will, and I don't want the fonts changed. But yeah, same thing.
Just want to say one thing. I don't want to speak for Lisa, our AAUP ringleader, but I think when we were talking in our discussions that she felt that EPS was the most reliable when they were moving to the other formats, which is why we were focusing on EPS, but we'll revisit that with her.
We'll do the next one. Yeah.
And I'll just add to that, I know that one reason that they'll use the EPS file is because the fonts are embedded. If you have a linked raster image, it's part of the file. You don't have to supply it separately. So, opposed to supplying like an Illustrator file, EPS is definitely preferred over that. But I've had some requests for TIFF files, but then they'll also say or a vector graphic. I don't think I've ever had anyone just ask for a TIFF, but yeah, the next thing on here about fonts being embedded in Editable, this might be in a later slide, but I'll talk about it now too, that I have had situations where I've gotten an old map that I've had to revise, from 10, 15 years ago, where the font is actually in an outline format, so it's not editable. So, all the other vector work is there, but the fonts itself, you just can't highlight it and edit it. So, the one thing that we had discussed is if anybody ever asks for that, also supply a file that has the live type in it, so that could be supplied later on if revisions need to be made. Do you want to talk about the metadata?
No, you can do that.
Okay. We were talking about the importance of having or unimportance of having metadata in the file that you're working on. So maybe the sources that you used, but not have it on the artboard, just in case the press needed to have that information. Does anybody else think that's important, or? Yeah, the projection that you use, but you think that's important to include? Just
Definitely do, yes.
yeah.
Because
I come from more from the GIS world, where metadata is crucial, depending, it might be related to infrastructure or something like that. So it would seem to me, if you're doing something to do with an academic fill in the blank, whatever it is, that you would need to know, provenance or something related to what it's based on, what's the reality of the data, where did it come from, what's the image, how important is that image to you, right? If it is, then you should have something that describes its importance.
Yeah, I think, speaking to what Patrick was saying about the sort of not wanting people messing with your file, one of the problems we run into is, for lack of a better word, institutional memory. I just had a map that I sent in in June to a press, and they came back and said, we're going to have to shrink this down so much, and they didn't realize it was a 2-page spread because the production manager had changed hands and it was a new person. And I can just imagine, we certainly run into situations where people come back 10 years later and say, we're doing a second edition. What is this thing? Where did it come from? What do we do with it? And one of the pieces that we were talking about is having as part of the metadata is who made it and how do you get in touch with them? Because, put your name and phone number or website or something on there so they can find you if they need to do a revised edition 20 years down the line. And they want to get in touch with you if they like the map and they want a new version of it. So, what?
Can I add one thing to the sure some of you have encountered the same thing. We'll do some maps for a faculty, and then 5 years later, the faculty member comes back to us and said, "Oh, you did some maps the other day," and so one thing we do is we keep a spec sheet. We have a centralized storage. We keep for each project. We keep a spec sheet on all the deliverables and what we're doing, and which comes in handy, I think, for that. As well as in the deliverable, we also give them all the contact information, what operating system it was made on, Illustrator, etc., for the publisher. But that spec sheet that we keep with our projects is really valuable because we can see what were going to be the deliverables, who made it within my staff, because we have student staff do a lot of this work that are gone every 2 years. So that comes in handy for us when we have to go back to projects.
So both metadata internally within for the cartographer and metadata for the sticks with the file.
A comment and a question. I had a unique situation one time where I was delivering files for end papers in August when apparently all the primary people leave and it's just the interns there, and they asked for an EPS, and it took many rounds of confusion to understand what was going on, but she was trying to open it in Photoshop and it was automatically changing the resolution to 72, and then she was saying, well, I need high resolution. I said, it is high resolution. I'm not sure if that kind of description would go in metadata, but it would be great to have a better interface between the interns or who's doing it that says, if it's an EPS, open it in Illustrator. It's an Illustrator native file. And then the other thing that a problem I've run into, which metadata could also solve, is the Adobe Pdf Presets. What does that printing company use and what do they prefer? And that would probably come from them, but stating what you've done in the metadata may also help. And I'm not sure.
Would you be willing to come forward so I don't have to run as far? Yeah, people in general, if you're willing to come forward, it'll save me some shoe leather. One of the things we talked about, it was programs, the specs as previously written included freehand, so they're clearly a couple years old. And we talked about, we were trying to get around the question of people creating maps for print publications in versions of ARC that they don't necessarily know how to get a really good print-ready PDF or AEI file out of, and how to step around. We don't want to say you can't make it in ARC, but you better really know what you're doing. And if you don't really know what you're doing, use Illustrator and be careful about anything you've gotten from some other source. That was kind of what we were trying to get at with this. If anyone has any ideas about how to frame that, how to avoid that particular.
One of the challenges that you see is you face it two different ways. Sorry. I think one of the challenges I think the cartographer face is you are byproduct of somebody's work, and somebody who is doing a layout, they are actually who controls everything, mostly the product. So whatever they feel comfortable, they want that product. So if the person is comfortable playing with the what do you call raster files, the TIFF files, they always will ask you, give me a TIFF. They will not say, oh, don't give me a EPS file or Illustrator files, because the person need to know how to use that in Illustrator file format, right? If that person is not comfortable, person is only comfortable with whatever the program they're using it, they will demand in that. So I think the question will be, how do you make a certain standard that many of the bigger publisher can adopt? That's what you have to aim for, not just saying, okay, we will form this standard. Say major publishers, bigger publisher, academic publishers, say these are the standard you should apply. And I think in that way, maybe there is a chances that majority of the bigger publisher will demand the layout people to understand those format and try to implement it. Otherwise, it's just, we try to implement something and they will not use it. So that's the one thing. Second thing I just thought of saying is ARC. For example, many people may design a map in ARC because they're used to ARC. I'm talking about the Esri ARC. But also at the same time, when they're trying to convert into Adobe Illustrator file format, and whatever you have designed in a layout, when you open an Illustrator, many things outside the layout will also come in. And so how do you play with that one? That also is a tricky thing. It's not just simple conversion from ARC to Illustrator.
Right.
we have kind of a cheat sheet that we use. So more and more we make a lot of our maps in Arc. Just the skills, the tools have gotten a little better in there over the years. And if you're just putting out a raster file for a deliverable, that's easy enough to do from ArcGIS. But we have a little cheat sheet, because if you're going to deliver an EPS or a PDF and you've done it in ArcGIS, that has to be cleaned up, because that PDF that you create out of ArcGIS is really dirty. It's a bad file, and it's going to give them grief. So we have kind of a cheat sheet steps we go through for my students who are designing the maps, to just how to convert from ArcGIS to Illustrator, mostly because we also do work in Illustrator. But I think that would be useful as just kind of key steps if you're going to go from ArcGIS to Illustrator, just to create a good PDF or EPS, how to do that.
That sounds like potentially something that NACIS, that's more on the NACIS side, if we wanted to sort of get a resource set for us to use, rather than something that the university presses would be talking to cartographers about. We should probably get moving on to the detailed things. So these are getting into the tall weeds here.
Yeah. So again, the pig in the poke problem is you don't know what's going to happen to your map after you release it, and even if you're working on a color map, something I hadn't really considered. Sometimes I do color maps for university presses occasionally, and I had never considered that after I'm gone, they might take it and turn it into a grayscale, and I have no idea how it's going to get converted and used. So we talked a little bit about that, and I'd be interested in hearing more about what people would suggest. To me, it seemed like if they want to use it as a grayscale, I would sort of want control of that, and it'd be a whole nother fee schedule. You'd have to produce them simultaneously, and they're two very different things in my mind. Yeah, so that's where we were with that, and input is most welcome.
Any thoughts?
Okay. Move along. Oh, so we just wanted to pause here and remember that we're developing guidelines and not rules. So this isn't to prevent anybody from working in the way that they're used to, but this is for a wider audience of authors and maybe not specifically cartographers that we can work with. And email us with thoughts that you have after today.
And one of the things we run into, because we're working, because cartographers are often working with the authors, is that the communication, the expert communication of, I'm a cartographer, I know what you're doing, I know what I'm doing, you're a production manager, you know what you're doing, we can talk turkey and get around the silly rules. If you're dealing with an author, they don't know, and they say, here's what they required, and I don't want to have to go back to my editor, and you don't, so that's what we're trying to avoid.
One more note on that topic. It used to seem like when I worked more directly with authors or designers even, 90% of the time they'd say, I'll send you a book, and I'd get a book in the mail after it went to press. And now lovely authors and lovely editors, but I very rarely get a book unless sometimes I'll go to launch parties just so that I can see what the maps turned out like, so the feedback loop is not as complete as it used to be. So if anyone has ideas for, I guess the answer is just checking in more with people, but to be able to physically see the print product is something that I miss.
So, deep weeds. So, talking about lines, we generally agreed in talking with amongst the three of us and with Lisa that 0.35 is a good guideline. Obviously, people can avoid that, but that's sort of in the middle of a minimum weight for a solid line. The problem of scaling is one of the ones that Lisa's talked about as a perennial problem, is that whatever scale you're going to design at, assume that it's going to be shrunk, because it may well be shrunken, by 5 or 10% or something like that. So that's the number we came up with. Anyone have any objection to that as a guideline? Good. It was kind of a compromise among various numbers that we had, and it was one we all agreed. I generally use half point as a minimum myself. Others were saying, yeah, 0.3, sometimes 0.25 is even okay. You can get away with that. But 0.35 seemed to be a fairly safe, somewhere in the middle. And again, this is. I mean, we specified this is the rock bottom minimum, and maybe we should say in the guidelines that 0.35 is a minimum, 0.5 is a safe, is a really safe minimum or something. You know, it's
Especially when you're considering that you don't have that final size. And if you are supplying those high-res TIFFs and they're just scaling those down to fit into those pages, 0.5 is probably going to be ultimately the most safe.
And then we started talking about lines that aren't solid black. And again, we just kind of came up with these as let's throw this out and see if this works. That if the line is going to be lighter than a 50% gray, then it shouldn't be any thinner than 1 point. And that's because of dot screen issues, that if you make it too much lighter, that the line starts becoming an in and out speckled thing. Particularly if it's a low DPI screen, if it's a coarse screen. And likewise, if it's darker than 50%, then 3/4 of a point. You can use white lines, and this is something we're putting in mostly just as a. By the way, you can do this because newer cartographers don't necessarily often think of that as a thing that they can do. But that they should be. This isn't in there, but we talked about having no thinner than 1 point for white lines against a tint, and you can use. I'm not sure why that's in there, but we kind of struggled with that, what we were talking about there. But we're talking about using, thinking about foreground and background, basically trying to give people some sense of, think about using the black hard lines for foreground and lighter things for background, so you can have some layering. Again, more for novice people. Any thoughts on line weight or numbers based on this disagreement?
I think guidelines are a great idea. I guess the only thing I would add there is recommendations, and just put that in the text, because I think there are reasons to vary it. Your explanation is perfect, but I think just even for novices to understand why it's like that, and just to say it's a guideline. We found this to work.
That's okay. No, you don't have to.
There are two things that I have some concern about here. Technically, the white lines no less than 1 point, but I always, at least conceptually, think that the eye can follow a very thin white line in a way that it can't necessarily follow a dark line on top of a tint. So unless you're actually afraid that the screen is going to fill in if that white line gets too thin, I'm not sure that there needs to be a minimum for the absence of ink. But my more philosophical concern is that once things like for background features, for things discussed in book, get into something that is called guidelines for contributors, then it comes back to bite us in the ass. And we have people saying, well, now this, the press guidelines say that you can only use white for background information. And pretty soon you've got somebody saying that ADA requirements mean that you cannot use oblique type under any circumstances, because they have misinterpreted to the third degree a guideline that someone once promulgated.
Good point. Yeah.
It's definitely a concern that I had, that I've mentioned a couple times, that doing this, it almost felt like writing a cartography textbook, and I'm like, is that really what we're trying to do here? And it's like I want it to be sort of the bare minimum without having too much detail that somebody thinks, okay, this is how I must follow these rules. So, yeah, I probably have gone way under 1 point for a white line, and no one ever complained, and it looked fine in the book. But so I think this is why we want everyone to think about this over the next couple weeks and send your thoughts in the emails, so that we can kind of see should we have a number? Should we just say be careful, and this is why?
And that's a useful point for us to make as we revise this, is to think about, make it more guideline-y.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, should we go on to?
Me? Okay. I'm going to pass this to Erin because she was taking the lead for this section.
Yeah, so we were talking about oftentimes I'll skip. I don't know if this is in the front. No. Sometimes whenever you get the guidelines, it'll have a grayscale value for tints, and it'll say, like, for example, go from 20% to 40 to 60 to 80 to 100 if you want to have a choropleth map. And so we were thinking that we should make a suggestion more like the logarithmic progression, where, the lighter values, you have the numbers can be closer together. As you get darker, they have to be more spread apart so that the darker colors don't get confused. And can you skip to the last slide? Yeah. So this, I just threw together this very abstract idea. I don't know why it's not very clear on here, but this was using Color Brewer just as a guideline. These aren't exact Color Brewer numbers here, but in our discussion we were thinking, well, what are some examples, and is this something that we would want to supply? Because some of the specs that we've seen, they do have a color ramp as an example. That is nothing that I would follow with the 20, 40, 60, 80. So, we kind of looked at this and thought, well, here's some examples. If you have 3 classes, 4 classes, if you have type over the color values, what would be acceptable? And my fear was sort of like what you're saying, is if we had something like this with these numbers, that something I see with the yellow to teal to blue color scheme with Color Brewer, you see that everywhere. And it's like, well, that should be a guideline, not something that everybody uses as a default. So I think that's sort of my fear of putting something like this in. Do you actually put numbers there, or do you just talk about the concept of how to think about your choices? So any thoughts on that?
I just want to say one thing, that this was an area where I think Lisa came back and said, well, one of the problems she has is the low reproduction. This is a place where low reproduction quality is really an issue, is that, what I would consider as a perfectly good screen or offset print range of, doing like 10 to 25 to 35 to 50 for a choropleth, you start losing, you get equivalent of dot gain and things dropping out, and we're not sure that 10% is dark enough to work in a lot of situations. 10% will drop out in some crappy reproduction situations.
I just want to remind anyone who has a really juicy University Press gig that proofing is so awesome. If a book has the budget to run proofs on this kind of thing, it's really helpful. And in my experience, which is limited in running proofs for university presses, but often the numbers are much lower than I would have thought just working on my laser printer or my Canon proofer in my office. So you can always ask.
Any thoughts about tint values, color ramps, what to specify, not to specify?
Just following the theme that guidelines can become requirements if you're not real careful how they're phrased. I think I would shy away from giving these specific examples and just say something very general like always take into account that press gain may add substantially to any tint choices that you make, and for that reason consider an approach that uses a logarithmic rather than an arithmetic progression. For more information, refer to Color Brewer or similar resources. So rather than putting any specific numbers in here, just hint to the newcomers where they can find useful information on that.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. I think it's generally an agreement if you're using grayscale, which most of these maps are that we're creating, keep your classes to 3 or 4 if you're doing a choropleth map, or even if you're doing a map where you might have subject, non-subject, here's some other non-subject here, here's a lake, you know, like it doesn't necessarily have to do with choropleth, just when you have lots of different items that you're representing. And sometimes I feel like that's more communication with the author. You know, if they want to have way too much information on the map, just express to them, hey, this is grayscale. This might get really confusing if you have way too many things on here. So don't feel afraid to communicate that maybe things could be worked out differently. We talked about whenever you have type, I mean, this is sort of a general cartography rule, not to cross your type over a line if you don't need to, but if you have to, have the masking behind it so that it's not conflicting. And we discussed a couple different ways that we do this. You know, some people will clip the line and turn that part transparent. Some people, like I'll use Map Publisher a lot to do the knockout tool. Other people will do the effect where they'll add a stroke behind in a layer. So again, we didn't really want to have a set way that you needed to mask your type because everybody has their own style, but we kind of felt that it was important to say that having type run over line is not an acceptable thing to do for legibility. And I think that's something that we would all probably agree with. So.
And you know, one of the guidelines that didn't make it into the presentation here was, oh, maybe it's under text, I think. We talked about masking. We talked about masking type so that you can't see type through holes in letters. That's sort of a rule of thumb. That
might not have made it on here.
Okay.
That might be in the broader guidelines.
So raster imagery.
Yeah, so like if you're going to have a terrain image in the background, if it's too dark, then it gets really muddy. But also if it's too light, then a lot of times it'll just fade out whenever it's printed. So these were numbers that we just came up with that, you know, between 10 and 30% grayscale worked pretty well for showing up and not taking away from all the type and line work that you have over top of it. And 300 DPI, when you have that embedded in your file, is the minimum that you would want to do. And again, embed the art. You can do that in EPS, so that way you don't have to provide the second file with the raster image, and it won't get lost. You know, you just have that one EPS file. So I think that's pretty straightforward.
We spent more time talking about fonts than, you know, any given cartographic group. We will spend more time talking about fonts than anything else. So again, thinking about guidelines, we got into the deep weeds and stayed in the deep weeds for a while when talking about this. And what you were saying about keeping it guideline-y, this is a place where leaning on cartographic experience and style, personal style and preference is really, you know, if you have it, use it, basically. Technically speaking, OpenType seems to be what people want if they can possibly use OpenType rather than PostScript or TrueType. And I know you had talked about the problem of people subbing in fonts when you didn't, Patrick, when you didn't want people subbing in fonts. Or editing the text. And that's kind of I think that may be a place where cartographers and publishers are going to arm wrestle over who gets control of the file. My sense from talking with Lisa is it actually is really important to have it editable because they don't know if you're going to be around or if, I mean, they're going to be, they are the ones who end up having to mess with deal with the file, and they may need to hire someone else or have someone internal. Who knows down the road. So I guess the question is whether, I mean, that it's almost like a diplomatic question rather than a technical question of how to handle. You put in your contract that you get final edit or something rather than I don't know how to get. I mean, Patrick, do you have any other thoughts about? You obviously have strong feelings about people messing with that.
Yeah. There we go. Yeah, it's not like I'm I'm on a mission that people are editing my work or anything like that. It's just occasionally I've run into that. If I can embed the fonts, I prefer to, and I prefer to give an EPS file. That's what I would love to do. They can't always handle that. So, I do, or sometimes I'll vectorize my fonts. It just depends on what the deliverables are, and kind of how I'm working with them. But for me, I have a document that says, and I'll often provide them actually the original Illustrator file even, as when I provide a deliverable, I usually provide 3 things. If it's, let's say this is a decent press, I'll give them an EPS with fonts embedded. I'll also often give them the fonts too as well. I will give them a high-res TIFF for proof, and then sometimes I'll give them the Illustrator file as well. So a lot of times I'll have a metadata document that documents all that. So sometimes that's what I'll give as deliverable, but I'll say use the EPS file, etc. So that's, in an ideal world, that's what I do. But
So I just want to ask a question that's a little bit sort of off track as from coming in and sitting down and being new to this project that you're working on. You mentioned not wanting to be writing a cartography textbook, and then we jumped right into the very, very fine detail, which is seeming what you're putting together. A little bit of kind of what I've seen is when looking at maps and things like that that are not done by the professional cartographers that you talk about, graphics people that are doing maps and things like that, is there any room for that level to put some kind of cartographic spin standardization at that level of, well, if we're making the guidelines that say, well, they need to somehow consult someone who knows geography. And I know that's not the guideline, but if there's room for the conversation to go in that direction of getting out of the skilled cartographer bubble, there are still maps being made. And can those be addressed in any way is just a question I want to put out there.
We actually addressed this early on, and it went kind of back and forth. The conclusion was that in our group was that we wanted to have one set of standards for that. We didn't want to muddy the waters, and that it was there isn't really a hard line between you know what you're doing, you don't know what you're doing, and so it was hard to sort of like, if you're in this group, use this set, and if you're in this group, use this set. That was actually I mean. No, but
I guess I'm not saying there should be 2 sets of standards, but I guess almost there should be, is there a way to have standards addressing different levels of
our conclusion was no. For what we're doing here. I mean, it does raise a point that I think is maybe useful for NACIS to consider is, do we, independent of AUP, do we want to say, can we develop sort of a basic document for you don't know what you well honestly some of the books that Esri Press and other people have come up with, that's a lot of what there are cartography textbooks and instruction books that are specifically for that purpose already out there. Maybe it's worth as a group us looking at what some of those are and just including those in documents, saying if you don't really know what you're doing, here are some resources for newbie people who feel out of their depth to go to.
Yeah, I see on many guidelines that will say, please, if you're making a map, consult a cartographer. So they have that up front, and a lot of the presses will have, a list of 5 or 6 cartographers that they'll give the names out to their authors. So that's all great. But I think that might be good. Come up with a couple resources. Like, if you can't get a hold of a cartographer, here are some, I don't know. Yeah. It's a tough one.
We'll talk about it.
Yeah. It's something to think about.
I just had a type question.
Oh, sure.
Or maybe 2 questions. I mean, one, I wonder if folks maybe I'm like the new generation, but I use Typekit a lot, and if folks have experience like working with Typekit fonts and press, and then also like I have never gotten, I always get the press guidelines, but they never say like our art department tends to use like X typeface when we set the book. And it would be so helpful to have like a list of our 3 favorite typefaces that your map might be set against or something, especially when dealing with authors. So I don't know if there's a way to get that in the guidelines, but like, of course, different presses do have different styles in-house, and I almost never have any sense like what the final book design is going to look like when I'm designing the map. So I'm just picking like a font I like that matches the theme, but not yet.
And I think one of the here we go. Just to respond to that, I think one of the things we had this goes back to the problem that they don't know the layout when they assign the map, so they don't know what the font's going to be either. And that, I mean, that's there are obviously exceptions to that, but that seems to be more and more the rule, is that when you get the map, they have no idea what the font choices are.
But they probably have like a designer who maybe like tends to use.
Yeah, well, I mean, the one press I've worked with a lot is Nebraska, the one that had the 4-page cartography guideline that they put out a year or two ago. And it used to be that I would contract directly with the press, and they would say, we're setting the book in Sabon, you can use that in your map. And like, they were really excited to work with me to have the font I was using in the book match what they were using, or, have the font in the map match the book. But then in their guidelines that came out, it said, use Helvetica. Just, that's it. And so that was the one complaint I had about, they had this rich set of guidelines, and they had that recommendation, but I think that was more because they started having their authors contact me instead of working directly with the press. Now, on the first page, it's like, here are some cartographers, you can contact them, and then I'm given the guideline by the author. So sometimes I will contact the press, around the corner, and I'll be like, hey, by the way, any way I could use something besides Helvetica in this book? And usually they're like, oh yeah, that's fine. I think on the next slide we had some, well, we can quickly just cover, oh, yeah.
I'm just going to talking to you. Yeah. So when I'm doing anything online and I would use a font stack, is there any room for something like that here? Where, an idea of, well, if this font, if that font's not available, this font, that type of thing, where like a hierarchy of things, because browsers will do that. I know these browsers will use this font, and if it's not available, well, don't go to just any, here's my second bet, if there's room for that sort of, I don't know, a thought.
So this was our stack that we made ourselves.
Okay. We'll hand it right back.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, this was our equivalent of the stack. Just the 4 of us. Yeah, the 4 of us. Oh, yeah. Tanya wasn't in this one, but we were. I mean, the fonts that we talked about was kind of just a loose list. But again, how to frame this as a recommendation rather than a requirement? That's a hard. Dennis's challenge is a hard one to look at. Dennis, you had thoughts?
Well, I was wondering about having a section for the university, for the press to step up. And so in here, have a section that says, our press typically sets 6x9 academic books in these faces. For trade books, talk with this art director about what might be a good choice, and put a little pressure on them to supply some information up front. And then I will just add that the one that I usually go to, because it's like the khaki of typefaces, it'll go with anything, is Optima.
So any thoughts on this, and then we'll go back to the previous page, just general thoughts about standards or recommendations for fonts based on this. We can go, Warning against overuse of bold. Be careful about bold, especially bold serifs. Don't necessarily look like you want them to. Using uppers and lower cases for most labels. This actually goes against some of the existing specs, which say use capitals, please. And when you do use uppers and lowers, don't use the switch. Use a font. Letter spacing. That caps and small caps often need extra tracking. Reverse type almost always needs extra spacing. Don't add extra spacing for point labels if you can help it. Pretty basic typographic rules of thumb, and these are again mostly for the less experienced. Let's go back one more. Oh, yeah.
I just assume you're going to have examples of all of these when you.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
It's probably going to be a text document that goes out. Yeah. This is probably going to just be done as a text document.
Yeah. And I think I'm just generally curious. Yeah, I think I'm maybe making some assumptions that you guys could dispel for me. I'm just interested in how, when this document gets put together, how it's distributed and to whom it gets distributed, and does it supersede the documentation that we get from the presses, or does it complement that documentation?
A lot of university presses based their own specific documentation off of the AUP. They started with the AUP standards and did their own version of it. And a lot of smaller presses simply take the AUP and send that out and say that we're not going to make our own version of it. Just take this. And again, it's a matter of size. Oxford has its own, but University of Eastern and Southern North Dakota doesn't. Okay. Yeah, let's go. Yeah. So
we didn't really talk about the size.
Sizing. Sizing. Does this look right to you? 6-point minimum if you're at 100%. 7-point is sort of a more standard. 6 point is as low as you should go. 7-point is probably a good, a better minimum if you can do it. Make serif type larger. Probably shouldn't go smaller than 8-point for serif type. Use bigger size for larger areas, and you can do screen to reverse type, but be really careful about it and keep it big. Probably sans serif, and just be careful about how you mess with tinted type. Use it really, or reverse type. That's basically it.
I guess my only comment would be kind of related to what we were talking about with like line weights, and like a minimum line weight if it's black over a light background or reversed out. Is that if we're thinking about the potential for it to be sized up or sized down, we could do some simple arithmetic to, we could imagine a 6-point label being sized down to have an effective size of 4.5 or 5-point. So if we're kind of thinking about the ranges at which our artwork might be resized and what the range of possibilities are, and we can't predict what that's actually going to be, but we might imagine that, like, generally for these guidelines, we're imagining that our artwork might be sized down to 80% or 70%, and if they go smaller than that, I mean, there's not much we can do as designers to really help them. They should have kind of talked to us more about like what the eventual layout was going to be, but if we have a number that we can peg to it, it'll help us with the guidelines that we set for the line weights, type sizes, a lot of these kinds of elements. Just that maybe you guys are already thinking along those lines, but it seems like a related issue to the previous one.
I wonder about maybe including in this a specification that you should assume that your map can be reduced by X%, and if the University Press needs to reduce it less than that, it should go back to the cartographer, just as a rule of thumb. 5 or 10% or something like that, as you build into your file that it can be reduced that much and not suffer irreparable harm. Yeah, if you go below 90%, then go back to the cartographer. Just University Press, do that, please, rather than just assuming that you can just shrink it indefinitely.
I just tell them, don't shrink it. I just tell them, don't do any edits or anything. Anything has to be done
And just repeating for the folks at home, Patrick says, "Don't shrink my map." Period. Hang on. She's seconding. Okay, Donna is seconding that.
But I think we all do. We all try to get the page specs as much as we can, right? And hopefully they're close. But so that's what I do. I put in there in my metadata document. I say don't make any edits or shrink this, or reduce this, or that sort of thing, or expand it if it's rasterized. But 10% sounds. It'd be interesting to see what is there kind of a general percentage that things tend to get resized. I'm curious. Some of you have a lot more experience than I do there. It's a tough thing to measure or quantify, but.
I think beyond 10%, you're getting into. I mean, the issue that I had was that I just had recently was that the thing I built is a 2-page spread. They were saying, we're going to have to reduce this like 60% in order to turn it sideways on the page. They didn't know it was a 2-page spread. So that it gives a feedback loop that will prevent issues like that. They potentially. All right. I think we're done with type. Yes. Anywhere further thoughts about type?
I think, for the map frame, neat line, we had some disagreements on how we handle this. So I always include the neat line in my file that I supply. But Lisa, who we were talking to, I think she was saying don't. Yeah, she said, have it cropped to a clipping mask, but that in InDesign they would put the frame on. So this is something that we were really looking forward to seeing what other people experience and what their habits are. Like I said, I always put the frame on, and no one ever tells me to do otherwise. And then the second part to this is we think it's good practice to include your line work beyond that frame, just in case in the future they do a revision and then you have that line work beyond the clipping mask. And for bleeds, I feel like there aren't that many bleeds in the maps that we tend to do for presses, but it's there just in case they ask for that later on. So I don't know, should we just do a show of hands who includes a frame? And then who just has nothing on the you just have no.
Use the artboard. Use the artboard as my and just deliver it as a EPS that they would then place as is. So
okay.
I'm curious, for those who do include the frame, do you, I can't remember if it was Lisa or Molly that was talking about, you actually give a document that's the 6x9 page. That's what I do. That's what Lisa does. You both do that, okay. And do you get any feedback you don't get any feedback from presses, that's fine, okay.
But whenever so even if I have the page at 6x9 and then I'll have the map on there, when I save the EPS file, it clips it to that. So the EPS doesn't have all the white space around it. I just tend to do that in Illustrator so I can visualize what it looks like on the page.
And the authors, I think, seem to find.
And the authors, I'll give like a PDF for the author to view, so then they can kind of visualize, oh, okay, this is how it looks on the page.
Interesting. So that's maybe a question to feedback to Lisa also, to get some more feedback from her from the press's point of view about what. Because it sounds like it works both ways.
I think all presses do it differently, so that might just be
a thing that the press should specify in their specifications. How do they want it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So are there people who do it both ways and get presses saying, no, I don't want that, I want the other way? Or do you just do it and they take it whatever they get?
Go ahead. Sometimes they just chop it off themselves, or maybe one side of it, and that's always fun.
Right.
But I always include it when I use a complex.
Hang on, Mark. We're trying to record this from us already here.
Just bellowing doesn't help. Yeah. So I generally include a frame when I'm doing something with a complex frame, which I like to do where the frame is actually instead of having an inset box for the legend, I actually drag the frame around it so that the legend is outside of the frame, but it's still within the rectangle of the map. So when it starts getting complicated like that, there's no way that you're going to expect the layout person to even think to do something like that. So you have to put it in there, and that's where you have to be careful that they don't decide to like just chop off the left-hand side of this complex box that you've put around everything. But I also tend to try to not have frames on them otherwise. So if I'm putting one on there, there's a distinct reason for it, and I want it to be this one. But otherwise, I tend to not use them at all.
Thanks. We've talked about map at final size if possible. Obviously, that's an ongoing issue. How do you communicate specs relating to sizing and positioning? I'm not sure if this means that. Well, I guess this is for university presses. Is that they need to include this information when they're speccing the map as a column width for a 2-page spread. Are you allowed to make maps that are turned 90 degrees to the page? Usually they are, but it seems like presses like to be asked if that's okay. Okay. So including all map content as sublayers in a single map layer, which includes a clipping mask. That's one technique other than just using the artboard.
Yeah.
Where did that come from? Is that?
Oh yeah, I just mentioned that's my style is all, but that doesn't necessarily have to be in the guidelines. These, like I said, these are all just notes that we've been taking. So I think a lot of it is style of the cartographer. A lot of it is what the press recommends. So we need to find a good balance of what we would include here. This was just how a file is constructed. That I tend to do the clipping mask so that when I save it as an EPS, it is trimmed to that instead of having like the big white frame around it. But everyone's different.
I wonder if maybe this is a question to talk with Lisa and AUP about it. Whether, as we're doing these specs, we should have sections that are just go straight through the cartographer. Here are recommendations for you for whatever you do, and there are sections that say, here are things that are clearly designer or layout and press specific. Make sure you spec this out as a press and say what it is so that we don't have to figure it out on our own. Yeah, and this is maybe one of those that
Yeah, there are things again, and you could just repeat it for me. Which direction they're going to rotate?
Which
a 90-degree rotated map.
Right. If you're going to turn a 90-degree map, are you going to turn top to left or top to right? We don't know. We'll find out. Okay, I think that's it for what we. Oh my God, we got through this. We got 10 minutes to go until we're done.
Do you want to put it on? Yeah.
Yeah. So this is obviously a work in progress. We're going to be taking comments and talking with Lisa some more to, integrate what we've heard here today. If you have further thoughts about this stuff, if you want a copy of this, contact one of us and we'll email you a copy of this. We'd love to get maximum feedback. We don't want to have to come back and do this again in another few years. So.
And I just want to say a big thank you to the three of you and a call to all NACIS members that this is a great way for NACIS to get involved and sort of have a voice, a very careful voice in the cartography industry of what are problems we're running into and how can we as a group work together to come up with some solutions for that. I know we all sort of hit those points, and so if we can be aware of when we're running into those things where we're sort of banging our head against the wall. There's probably other ones of us doing that also, other people doing that also. So let's work together to put some of those solutions like this together. You guys have put a ton of work into this, and it's going to benefit so many people, both that regularly attend NACIS and people that we don't even know who will be using them. So, anybody else want to say?
Yeah, so we have this email address that all three of us will be able to access, and we'll be looking at it over the next couple of weeks. And I know that Twitter is pretty big here at NACIS, so you know, there could be a hashtag for like NACIS AAUP if you would want to put something out there on Twitter too. I'll probably tweet something after this, one of my 5 tweets I do a year. So I'll put something out there so we can have things on Twitter, email us your thoughts, you know, take some time to think about it. And we're really excited to hear what everyone has to say, because I know we all have our strong opinions, and we want to have a good set of guidelines so that we can work well with the presses and we have a good relationship.
So thanks everyone for coming. This has been good and productive. I appreciate it.